I need you to understand something before I tell you this story. I spent 31 years in the Australian Army. I did 2 tours of East Timor, 1 of Afghanistan, and more training exercises across Southeast Asia than I can count on both hands. I have been shot at. I have slept in mud for 11 consecutive days during a field exercise outside Townsville and considered it ordinary. I have watched men I called brothers get carried off in helicopters and not come back. I know what it means to stay calm under pressure, to read a situation correctly before it deteriorates, to identify a threat before it becomes a crisis. I am not a man who panics. I am not a man who makes careless decisions. I am not a man who gets taken advantage of, or so I believed, standing in the arrivals hall of Suvarnabhumi Airport on a Tuesday afternoon in April with 66 years on my body, 465,000 Australian dollars in the bank, and the absolute unshakable conviction that I had finally, after a lifetime of discipline and sacrifice and showing up for other people's emergencies, earned something good. I was wrong about all of it. Not about the money, not exactly. What I was wrong about was the certainty. The certainty was the problem. The certainty was the thing she used. The property fraud did not happen to me because I was foolish or careless or blinded by something I cannot account for. It happened because I was absolutely certain I was not the kind of man it could happen to. And that certainty, that particular military-grade confidence in my own assessment of a situation, was the most expensive flaw I have ever had. More expensive than the $92,000 I put into the house. More expensive than the $11,000 I gave to her brother in what I called loans and what were, in retrospect, something else entirely. It was expensive in ways that do not appear on any financial statement and that I am still paying at 68 in the currency of trust. My name is Frank. I grew up in Toowoomba, Queensland, the second of 4 children. My father was a diesel mechanic who worked long hours and came home with oil under his fingernails and very little patience for complaining. My mother worked lunches at a school canteen for most of my childhood and managed the household with the kind of quiet competence that only becomes visible when you are old enough to understand how difficult that actually was. We were not poor in the way that leaves permanent marks. But there was never money that did not have somewhere it needed to go, and the concept of spending on things you did not strictly need was not something I was raised to consider or to want. You worked, you saved. You did not expect more than you could account for. These were not values I was taught explicitly. They were values I absorbed from the way the house ran. I joined the Army at 18 because it was a job, and because Toowoomba, in 1974, did not offer a great many alternatives to a kid with average grades and a strong back and a genuine appetite for structure. I expected to stay 3 years. I stayed 31. The Army became, in every meaningful sense, the organizing principle of my entire adult life. It gave me purpose, identity, community, a sense of exactly where I fitted in the world and what I was for. It gave me the capacity to function under conditions that would paralyze other people. It gave me a pension, a commendation I keep in a box in the wardrobe without looking at, a knee that aches in cold weather from a fall on a hillside in East Timor that I never properly reported, and a mild but permanent hearing loss in my left ear from a training incident in 1996 that I told the medical officer was less significant than it was. You do those things when the Army is your world and you do not want to be sidelined from it. You minimize the damage so you can stay in the thing that defines you. I did not understand at the time what a good rehearsal that was for how I would eventually handle the damage Wasana caused me. My marriage ended 12 years before I left the Army. Carol and I had been together for 19 years, and the divorce was not a dramatic event. Not the kind that announces itself with raised voices and thrown objects. There was no particular betrayal, no single confrontation that I still turn over in my mind at 3 in the morning. She said the army had always been my real marriage, and she was not wrong, and we parted on terms that were civil and entirely final. We had no children. I have not spoken to her since 2004. In the years after the divorce, I did what I always did when the shape of my life changed. I poured myself back into work because work was what I understood, and because the alternative, the open space of a personal life that was not organized around duty and deployment and the needs of other people, was something I genuinely did not know how to navigate. 2 more tours followed. A promotion I had been waiting on for longer than was strictly fair arrived. When I finally signed my retirement papers in Darwin in 2018, I was 64 years old, living in a serviceable flat, and I had not had a relationship of any meaningful kind for more than a decade. I told myself I did not miss it. I had a real talent for telling myself things that were not entirely true and making them feel like established facts through sheer repetition. Thailand entered my life through a man named Terry, a former warrant officer I had served alongside in the 90s, a solid soldier who had retired to Chiang Mai 4 years before me and had been sending enthusiastic emails about it ever since. Thailand this, Thailand that. The cost of living, the weather, the food, the friendliness of the people, the way the light looks on temple rooftops at 6 in the morning in the old city. Terry had the quality of a man who discovers a place and cannot stop talking about it, who becomes its ambassador to everyone he knows, whether they have asked for the service or not. And I had been deleting his emails or reading them in the half-attentive way you read things you do not want to act on, because acting on them would require admitting you want something. Then I retired, and Darwin in the dry season has its own beauty, but it is a solitary beauty, and I was 64 years old and solitary in a way that was starting to feel less like discipline and more like vacancy. I read Terry's emails again, properly. In February 2019, I booked a 2-week holiday to Chiang Mai. Just a look, I told myself. Nothing more than that. What nobody adequately communicates, or what I had not been listening when they tried, is how a place can get inside you in ways you did not prepare for. I had been to Southeast Asia many times during my service, which means I had been present in Southeast Asia the way a soldier is present, which is to say professionally, occupying a bubble that filters out everything except the mission objective. Going as a private civilian in my mid-60s with nowhere to be and nothing to do except experience things was entirely different, and I was not ready for how different it was. The early morning light on temple rooftops, the sound of a provincial city coming alive before 6 a.m. when the monks are already moving, and the market stalls are setting up, and the air smells of charcoal and jasmine and something sweet frying in oil. A bowl of cow tom rice porridge eaten at a folding table in a side alley for 40 baht, while a street dog watched me from a careful distance, and the world felt, improbably and without precedent, like a place of genuine possibility. I had not felt that quality of possibility in a very long time. I had not felt anything that resembled it. I extended my 2 weeks to a month. I flew back to Darwin, canceled my lease, arranged storage for my furniture, and booked a one-way ticket. Terry met me at the airport wearing the expression of a man whose advice has been vindicated and who is very pleased about this. I spent 3 months in Chiang Mai, then began drifting as the cool season faded, drawn eastward by a vague instinct that the tourist infrastructure of the north was not quite the texture of life I was looking for. By September 2019, I had settled in Khon Kaen in the northeast, in the region Thais call Isan. This was not a destination that featured in travel magazines. There were no beach bars or western brunches or boutique hotels catering to the recently retired. It was a provincial city, larger than it looked on a map, with a university and a reasonable hospital and a 6-day market and a small but established community of foreign men, mostly older, mostly paired with Thai women, some of whom had been there long enough to have the settled quality of people who have stopped looking over their shoulder toward somewhere else. I found a serviced apartment on a quiet soi near the university, bought a second-hand Honda motorbike from a man who shook my hand twice as though sealing a formal agreement, and began constructing the daily routines that a life requires. Coffee at a place near the campus with good air conditioning and unreliable Wi-Fi. Evening motorbike rides along the reservoir road when the heat dropped enough to make it pleasant. Thai language lessons twice a week from a retired school teacher named Ajarn Tong, who had more patience than I deserved. I was not unhappy. I was, for the first time since I could accurately remember, present in my own life without a specific external purpose to justify the presence. It was an unfamiliar state but not an unpleasant one. I was learning to occupy it. I met Wassana in November 2019 at a government administrative complex where I had gone with a folder of documents and a list of questions about converting my tourist visa to a long-term retirement extension. She worked at the land office in the same building and had come out to the waiting area when the visa officer was occupied with something else, offering to translate on my behalf because my Thai at that point consisted of greetings, food vocabulary, numbers, and the phrase, "For where is the bathroom?" and I had been visibly struggling with a form that asked for information I did not know how to express. She handled the interaction with a calm, unhurried efficiency that I noticed in a professional way before I noticed anything else. She knew which form I needed and where to find it. She knew which official had authority over which question. She spoke to the visa officer in rapid Thai with a precision that produced results in approximately 4 minutes, while I had been circling the problem for 40. When it was resolved, she turned back to me and smiled, not the wide service industry smile I had learned to recognize as ambient decoration rather than genuine warmth, but something quieter and more considered, and said my Thai was better than most Farang she met, which was kind and not accurate, and I thanked her and went about my day. We ran into each other again the following week at the evening market near the old bus terminal. She was with a colleague from the land office, and I was alone as I typically was, and we stopped and talked for perhaps 25 minutes. She asked what I had done before Thailand, and I told her about the army, and she listened with attention that was not performed, that had the quality of someone actually tracking what you are saying rather than waiting for you to finish. She asked specific follow-up questions. She wanted to know what the hardest part had been, not the most dangerous or the most dramatic, but the hardest, and I thought about it for a moment before answering, which I did not always do with that question. I told her it was being responsible for young men who trusted my judgment more than I sometimes trusted it myself, the weight of being someone else's certainty when your own was uncertain. She was quiet briefly, and then said that sounded like being an older sibling. I asked about her family. She mentioned her mother in the village outside the city, a brother who ran a small business here in Khon Kaen, a life that had been assembled carefully from limited materials and that she was quietly proud of. By the time we said goodbye, I had her number and a feeling in my chest that I recognized and had been careful not to encourage for a long time. I drove home on the Honda and told myself to remain sensible. We began seeing each other in December. I was deliberate about being cautious, or I told myself I was being deliberate about being cautious, which is a different thing. I had absorbed enough expatriate conversation about relationships in Thailand to know the general shape of how these situations could go wrong. The money sent home to families, the requests that accumulated like compound interest on a debt you did not notice incurring, the gradual reorganization of your finances around someone else's needs framed as cultural obligation. I told myself I would watch for these patterns, stay clear-eyed, apply the same analytical discipline to my personal life that I had applied to operational decisions. What I did not account for was that Wasana did not match the patterns I was watching for, and that failing to match a known pattern is not the same as being safe. It is sometimes simply a more sophisticated approach to the same outcome. She worked full-time at the land office and earned her own salary. She sometimes paid for meals, which surprised me and which I treated as meaningful evidence about her character. She spoke about money with a directness I found refreshing, saying she had grown up with very little and had learned to be careful because no one else was going to be careful on her behalf. She sent money to her mother each month, a fixed and modest amount, which she described not as an unavoidable obligation, but as a choice she made freely because her mother had sacrificed a great deal for her and she intended to honor that. I heard this and told myself it reflected well on her. It did reflect well on her. That was true, and it was also not the whole story, which is the particular difficulty of red flags attached to genuine virtues. You see the virtue first, and the flag disappears behind it. Her brother Arthit came up in conversation several times during those early months, mentioned with the mixture of affection and mild exasperation that is the standard emotional tone of someone who has spent years being responsible for a sibling who is more talented than organized. He ran a small business importing and distributing automotive parts to repair shops across the province, and he was, according to Wassana, excellent at the practical side of it, at knowing what mechanics needed and where to source it and how to communicate with people, but not disciplined about cash flow or paperwork or the administrative detail that keeps a business solvent over time. She worried about him in the background way of someone who has been worrying about the same person for so long that it has become ambient rather than acute. I listened and filed it under the category of normal family complexity and did not think about it much further. I had no reason to think about it further. Not then. By February 2020, I had met her mother in the family village 40 kilometers east of the city. A small woman in her early 60s who communicated entirely in Isan dialect and looked at me with an expression that combined curiosity and assessment in proportions I could not precisely measure. I ate meals in the family house, a place with teak support posts and a corrugated tin roof, and a smell of dried fish and orchid fertilizer that I came to associate permanently with Saturday afternoons. I was welcomed in the particular way that a Thai family welcomes the older foreign man their daughter has brought home, which is to say with warmth on the surface and careful evaluation underneath, and I felt the warmth more than I registered the evaluation because I wanted to feel it and because I was 67 years old and had been living in a narrow emotional bandwidth for so long that genuine warmth, when it reached me, was difficult to be skeptical about. The mother called me a name I could not reproduce accurately. Wassana translated it as something like trustworthy elder. I stood in that tin-roofed house and felt a surge of pride in being called trustworthy that was being produced in me deliberately and that I received whole because I needed it to be true. I had been renting a house on the eastern edge of the city since arriving in Khon Kaen, a single-story place with a small garden that the owner now wanted to sell. In March 2020, I raised the question with Wasana about whether buying it might make sense. I want to be precise about this. It was my idea. She did not suggest it, did not arrange the conditions that led to it, did not push me toward it. I raised it, and she gave me the careful, legally accurate response that I should have sat with for longer than I did. She explained that foreigners could not own land in Thailand directly in their name, that the usual options were a long-term lease, a company structure, or putting the title in the name of a Thai partner. She said this was something I should think carefully about and discuss with a lawyer before proceeding. I noticed her caution and interpreted it as evidence of her integrity. She was warning me, after all. She was not pressuring me. She was advising care. I used her caution to conclude that she was trustworthy and used that conclusion to proceed. I consulted a lawyer, briefly. He explained the structures available and answered my questions, and I decided, with the smooth confidence of a man who has made consequential decisions under pressure and learned to trust his judgment, that putting the property in Wassana's name was the practical and sensible arrangement given the relationship we had built. The house cost 2.8 million baht, approximately 92,000 Australian dollars at the April 2020 exchange rate. I paid in full by bank transfer. The title deed was registered in her name at the land office where she worked, processed by her colleagues, handled with the institutional familiarity of someone who understood the documentation perfectly. I stood in that office and watched her move through the process, and I thought, with a satisfaction I am embarrassed to remember, how fortunate I was to be with someone who could navigate these things on my behalf. I did not think, standing there, that a woman who works at the land office and has professional access to the property registration system and knows every official in the building is, from a different angle, precisely positioned to do what she later did. I had not yet developed that angle. We established ourselves in the house. I watered the garden every morning at 6 because early rising was too deeply installed in me to stop. I fixed things when they needed fixing, kept the place clean, made it habitable in the way that military service trains you to make any space habitable. Wasana brought her own objects and habits, and the house became genuinely shared in the way that daily life makes things shared, regardless of what the documents say. I was content in ways that I did not have better words for. That is the truth. I was genuinely, unperformatively content. The first request for money came in July 2020. The pandemic had hit supply chains badly, and Arthit's automotive parts business was in serious difficulty. Wassana mentioned this one evening in the quiet way she had of raising things she had been thinking about for longer than she let on. She was not asking me directly for money. She was describing a situation, inviting my response. I offered a loan of 100,000 baht, roughly $3,200, to help cover immediate gaps. She thanked me with warmth I took as genuine. The money was not repaid. I noticed the non-repayment and chose not to press it. Thai family finance was different from what I was used to, I told myself. This was the kind of assistance families absorbed without formal accounting. The second request came in October. A delivery vehicle had broken down irreparably, and without it the business could not fulfill its orders. Another 150,000 baht. I agreed again. By December, when a third, smaller request arrived for warehouse rent, I had started to feel the faint early warning signal that I recognized from operational experience, the ambient unease that precedes an identifiable problem. But I looked at Wasana across the kitchen table, and I thought about every piece of evidence I had accumulated in favor of her character, and I decided the signal was paranoia rather than perception. This is, I think, the most important moment in the whole story. Not the house purchase, not the discovery phone call, not the confrontation afterward. This moment, when I had a clear signal and chose to override it with the evidence I had curated to support the conclusion I preferred. Everything that followed was the consequence of that choice. What I did not know and would not discover for another 8 months was the full architecture of what had been happening in parallel with our ordinary daily life together. The money I had given Arthit had gone, in part, toward costs associated with a formal bank loan application he had been pursuing. The bank required collateral for a commercial loan of the scale Arthit needed. The only collateral of sufficient value available to the family was the title deed to the house where I lived, the house that was registered entirely in Wassana's name. She had agreed to pledge it as security for her brother's loan. She had done this through her professional knowledge of the land office process, her familiarity with the documentation required, and her access to the administrative infrastructure that governed property transactions in the province. She had not told me, she had not asked, She had not mentioned it in any context. The loan amount was 3 million baht, approximately 98,000 Australian dollars at the prevailing exchange rate. I found out on a Wednesday morning in late June 2021. I was at the kitchen table eating toast when my phone rang with an unfamiliar local number. The man on the other end introduced himself as a loan officer from a commercial bank and spoke in careful, functional English. He said he was calling to confirm my awareness of the loan arrangement connected to the property at my address, to discuss repayment, and to advise that 3 consecutive installments had been missed and the bank was beginning its formal recovery process. He named my address. He named the loan amount. He asked, with the professional patience of a man who has made this kind of call before, whether I was aware of the arrangement. I said I would call him back and ended the call. There was a ceiling fan above the kitchen table that had been making an irregular clicking sound for several weeks. I had been meaning to have someone look at it. I had not gotten around to it. I sat in the kitchen listening to that clicking and looking at the toast on the plate in front of me, and I felt something happen in my chest that I can only describe as a cold spreading downward, the physical sensation of a structure failing beneath you. The room was entirely ordinary. Everything in it was in its usual place. Nothing had changed except everything. Wasana was at work. I called her mobile twice before she answered on the 3rd attempt. I told her, quietly and precisely, what the bank officer had said. The silence on the line was not the silence of someone receiving unexpected information. It had a different quality, the quality of a pause during calculation rather than surprise. I had heard similar silences before. I recognized it as I heard it. She came home early, and we sat at the kitchen table in the house I had bought and paid for and had no legal claim to, and she explained, in a voice maintained at a deliberate calm, that Arthit had been in serious trouble, that the bank loan had seemed like the only real option, that she had fully intended to tell me but had been afraid of my reaction, that she had believed the business would recover and the loan would service itself and the entire matter would resolve without requiring my awareness. She said she had done it for her family. She said this several times in different arrangements of the same words. She did not say she was sorry, not in a way that carried weight. I asked about the documentation. She explained that because the title was registered in her name, her authorization to use it as collateral had been entirely legal and had not required my signature or consent. This was accurate. This was the legal structure I had agreed to, which the lawyer had explained to me, and which I had decided applied differently to my situation than to the general case. The house was hers in every legal sense. She could do with it as she chose. I had purchased a property, paid in full, and was living in it, and the law had nothing to say on my behalf because I had structured the transaction in a way that gave the law nothing to work with. My certainty that love and legal vulnerability were separable had cost me the house. I engaged a lawyer within the week. He was recommended by Ray, an Australian expat I knew from a coffee shop, a former civil engineer who had been in Khon Kaen for 6 years and who listened to my situation with the particular expression of a man who is not surprised but is sorry. The lawyer was thorough and direct. He confirmed that the property was wholly in Wassana's name and the encumbrance against it was entirely legal. My contribution to the purchase price was, in the absence of any written agreement describing it as a loan or investment, a gift made to the title holder. The bank would proceed with its recovery process. The property would likely be sold at auction. Whatever proceeds remained after the debt was settled would accrue to Wasana as the legal owner. I would receive nothing because I owned nothing and had never owned anything, regardless of who had paid. I sat in the lawyer's office with my notebook open and wrote things down in neat handwriting because that is what I do when I need to process information I do not want to receive. Total financial exposure, $92,000 for the house, $11,000 in money to Arthit, roughly $40,000 in accumulated living costs over 2 years. Approximately 143,000 Australian dollars had left my accounts and would not come back. I still had $322,000 in Australia. I was not destroyed in the way I had feared I might be when I first sat on the kitchen floor after the phone call. I was significantly poorer, significantly shaken, and significantly recalibrating my understanding of my own judgment. Ray took me for a beer after the meeting at a place near the university that stayed cool, even in the late afternoon, because it had a large ceiling fan that worked properly, unlike mine. He told me his own version of a similar story, different in specifics but recognizable in architecture. He had been in Khon Kaen long enough to say, without malice, that most of the foreign men he knew there had some variation of this experience somewhere in their Thai life, that the ones who escaped it entirely were either fortunate or had maintained a level of distrust that had also cost them the possibility of genuine connection, which was its own kind of tax. He said this without any suggestion that it made what happened to me acceptable or that I should have known better, just as a statement of the landscape as he understood it after 6 years in it. I confronted Wassana a second time a few days later, when I had allowed myself to be calm. I told her I knew more than she had told me in the first conversation, and I asked for the complete account. She gave me more, though I believe she still held things back. The business had not been struggling. The business had failed entirely by mid-2020. The bank loan had not been intended to rescue operations or purchase equipment. It had been used to settle Arthit's existing debts to private money lenders who charged rates I will not specify, except to say they made the bank's commercial rate look charitable. The loan was not being serviced because Arthit had no income and no business and no realistic prospect of either in the near term. The bank had extended patience for as long as its policies permitted and was now executing recovery proceedings. The house would go to auction. At some point during that conversation, she said, I did not understand how Thai family obligations worked, that a sister who had the means to help could not simply refuse when a brother came to her in genuine crisis, that the cultural concept of kreng jai, the deep reluctance to cause pain to someone you love, had made it impossible to tell Arthit no. I said I understood kreng jai was a real and significant cultural value, and that I nonetheless believed it applied to deciding whether to decline a social invitation, not to pledging $100,000 of another person's financial security without their knowledge. She looked at me with those steady eyes that I had first noticed in the government waiting room, and I understood that we had reached the place beyond which no further conversation was going to be useful. I packed my things in the methodical way the army instilled, taking what was mine and leaving what was not, and not spending more time on the distinction than the situation warranted. The yellow umbrella was in the stand by the front door, the one she always kept in her bag. I looked at it for longer than I looked at most things. I picked up my bags and left it there. I flew back to Brisbane and stayed with my sister. She gave me the spare room without requiring justification, and she did not say the things people sometimes say when they have been proved right about something, partly because she had met Wasana once over a video call and said she seemed lovely, which made the proving right complicated. I stayed 6 weeks, then found a rental in a suburb I knew nothing about, and began reassembling the ordinary furniture of a daily life. Accounts reconciled, storage retrieved, pension redirected, routines established. $317,000, 68 years old, starting from approximately 2/3 of my previous position, which was not nothing, and which I had to keep reminding myself was not nothing. What I understand now, that I did not understand then, is not primarily about Thailand, which I want to be careful to say because I think the easy version of this story makes Thailand the lesson. Thailand is not the lesson. The lesson is what I brought to Thailand. I brought a man who had spent 31 years in an institution that trained him to be confident in systems he understood, and who had never adequately reckoned with the implications of not understanding the system he was in. I brought the specific blindness of someone so practiced at being competent in his own context that he could not recognize the shape of his incompetence in a different one. I brought a decade of deliberate solitude that had left me with a hunger for warmth that I could not acknowledge directly. So I channeled it into certainty instead, and told myself my certainty was the same thing as safety. Wasana was not a simple villain, and I have made my peace with the discomfort of that. I do not think she was entirely false from the beginning. What I believe is that she was a person under genuine pressure with limited options who used the tools available to her, including me, and the trust I had offered her, as practically as she could in a difficult situation. I do not forgive it. I am describing it because the simple version, in which she was purely predatory from the first moment, is not the version that contains the real lesson. The real lesson is that love and exploitation are not mutually exclusive and can operate within the same person at the same time, and that the trust you extend to someone does not prevent them from acting against your interests when their circumstances put sufficient pressure on the choice. This is hard to hold in your mind, but I think it is necessary to hold it. What I know now in specific and practical terms, property in Thailand cannot be held safely through informal trust in a partner. It must be held through legal structures, lease agreements, written contracts, documentation that survives the dissolution of the emotional relationship and is legible to a court. What I know is that due diligence in a foreign legal system requires legal expertise in that system, not just confidence transferred from another context. What I know is that the qualities you most admire in a person are sometimes precisely the qualities that will be turned against you, and that there is no personality checklist that grants immunity to this. The woman who handles documents with professional confidence and navigates bureaucratic processes with quiet efficiency is also, in a different light, the woman who knows exactly how to encumber your property without your knowledge. I am 68 years old. I have a knee that aches in cold weather and a left ear with a permanent high-frequency gap and $317,000 and a rental apartment in a Brisbane suburb that I chose primarily because it was available. I have this story, which I tell reluctantly to men who seem as though they might need it, and I watch their faces as I tell it, and I can see in some of them the precise expression of a person deciding that their situation is different. I wore that expression for 2 years. It was very comfortable, and it was the most expensive thing I have ever owned. If you are reading this and you are older and you are in Thailand or thinking about going to Thailand and you are considering putting property in a partner's name because that is simply how it works there, I need you to hear this one specific thing. The legal structure is not a cultural formality to be navigated around as a matter of trust. It is the entire basis of who owns what if the trust breaks down. You need documentation. You need a lawyer who works for you specifically before any money moves, before any title is signed, before any relationship makes documentation feel like an accusation. You need written agreements that describe every transfer of money with a clear record of what it represents and what obligation it creates. You need to have the conversation that feels unromantic and suspicious and transactional, because that conversation is the most honestly loving thing you can do for both yourself and the person you are with. A partner who objects to protecting your interests in writing is not a partner whose love you can count on. I did not know that when it mattered. I know it now. The garden at the house needed watering every morning because the dry season in Khon Kaen is relentlessly dry. I was the one who watered it every morning at 6 because old habits don't leave you even when everything else does. I do not know who waters it now. Perhaps no one. The plants I put in along the front fence were not indigenous and probably would not have survived without consistent attention, which suggests they are dead. I think about that with more regularity than seems proportionate, and I have decided this is simply where the grief settled, and that grief finds its own addresses, and there is not always a rational reason for which one it chooses. At least I can still pack efficiently. I say this to people when they ask how I am managing, and it is the closest I get to the dark humor that gets you through things that do not resolve cleanly. You find out what you are made of when the ground you built on turns out to have been someone else's all along. In my case, I am made of a stubbornness that turns out to be useful, a financial caution that arrived about 3 years too late, and the willingness to stand in this story and tell it to strangers in the hope it lands differently for them than it would have landed for me. The rules are not different in Thailand. They are exactly the same everywhere. I simply needed to believe they were different. I do not know what comes next. I know how to pack. I know, now, to read the documents. That is what you take with you from the things that cost you most. Not the money, which is just money, but the knowledge that your certainty is not the same thing as safety, and that the most dangerous thing a man can say to himself in Thailand or anywhere else is that his situation is different from all the others. It never is.